Paul, and please come to the window so I can just see you. I saw you smoking before, and I kissed the limousine you looked at him. But I love you, and I want you, Paul. Please look at it. And Ringo, you can look at it too, because I like it.
Hello, friends, and welcome to my channel. She is Hanani, and, well, she is me. We have a powerful potential in our youth, and we must have the courage to change old ideas and practices so that we may direct their power towards good ends. Mary McLeod Bethune. So the term youthquake was coined by Diana Vreeland, who was the editor-in-chief of Vogue magazine in 1965. This term referred to the cultural movement that was happening with the youth in the 60s, and it started on the streets of London. So the movement revolved around pop culture as a whole at the time. So it involved music and lifestyle, and consequentially affected fashion. This marked a turn in cultural influence as far as fashion goes, because the youth took the power away from English and Parisian couture houses and gave it to your everyday kid, who at the time were baby boomers, but, you know, baby boomers.
That's my thing. I'm hip, I surf the web, I text, LOL. Laugh out loud, OMG, oh my god, WTF, why the face?
This period of time was marked by these major shifts in culture and major movements of the 1960s that consequentially affected the youth and that the youth were a big part of. The 60s saw an emergence in the civil rights movement, in Mexican-American activism, in environmentalism, and in opposition to the Vietnam War. The first stirrings of the gay rights movement also started around this time. Counterculture and quickly changing societal norms gave the youth a platform that they hadn't had before to really express their passions. Since fashion is historically representative of culture, this rise in activism went hand in hand with the styles and the trends of the time. While the term youthquake typically just refers to the movement in the 1960s, I've noticed that there are other very significant times in modern history where the youth have dominated and therefore dominated fashion and trends. In this video, though, I'll be specifically looking at youth culture and how it affected fashion in the 1920s, the 1960s, and the early 2000s. So before we get into the specifics of the 20s, the 60s, and Y2K, I wanted to quickly dive into activism in fashion and how activism impacts fashion and fashion impacts activism. As I mentioned before, fashion and activism have always gone hand in hand. In fact, fashion is inherently political. Henry Navarro Delgado stated in his article entitled "Fashion's Potential to Influence Politics and Culture," quote, "What one wears and how one wears it and when one wears it constitutes expressions of degrees of social freedoms and influences. Dress expression ranges the full political gamut from conformity to rebellion. Simply put, dress style that challenges or is perceived as challenging or offering an alternative to the status quo spontaneously acquires political meaning." Going back to the 1770s and the American Revolution, women did not have many rights at all, including the right to vote. But many women did what they could to be politically active. Women engaged in the politics of the day through politicizing traditionally feminine spaces, such as domestic clothing production. In order to prevent a dependence on British imports and to defy British imperial taxation, revolutionary women made hand-spun clothing. In the 1840s, Amelia Bloomer, activist and editor for the first American newspaper that was for women called The Lily, saw women's dress of the time as restrictive and degrading. So some women began wearing the short dress that they felt allotted them more freedom. After their example, Amelia published an engraving of herself wearing this outfit in The Lily. This resulted in plenty of ridicule at the time, but it also resulted in an uptick in interest in Amelia's newspaper. This also resulted in the outfit being named the Bloomer after Amelia. At the beginning of the 20th century, the suffragettes wore white as a part of a trinity of colors: white for purity, purple for dignity and loyalty, and green for hope. The clear correlation between fashion and activism continued throughout the next 170 years. Moving forward to the 1950s and 60s, people on the front lines of the civil rights movement used style as a way to combat racist stereotypes. These stereotypes included the negative view that black people were poor or lazy. So these style choices were made to help dignify the movement. Black Americans were fighting to be seen as humans and to be fully integrated into a system that had for so long denied them. Fashion played a huge role in communicating that with a very sharp-dressed black body. Oh, my people of color, I'm pretty sure you heard your grandparents use the word sharp 1 or 2 or 50 times. They dressed modestly, with many women in skirts with lowered hemlines and cardigans and neatly pressed blouses and stockings. This style was the quintessential Sunday's best. And the men did the same. They marched in dark colored suits, white undershirts, and ties. The Black Panthers of the 1960s wore a uniform that consisted of a black jacket, blue shirt, black pants, black shoes, black gloves, and a black beret. And the black beret was actually inspired by a film that was about the French resistance to Nazis in World War II. Actress Katharine Hepburn scandalously wore pants on screen back in the 1940s, and in 1966, several restaurants were called out for not seating women who were wearing pantsuits. Women on the front lines of the women's liberation movement in the 1970s wore denim and experimental styles to challenge traditional feminine dress. Skipping forward to the 21st century, in 2017, many people at the Women's March in Washington adorned pink hats. Sorry guys, I don't want to get demonetized on my first video. To destigmatize the word and protest against the idea that men held the right to do whatever they wished with a woman's anatomy. Celebrities have used their platforms for fashion activism as well, like Left Eye's condom accessories or Lady Gaga's meat dress. We are still seeing this today, and a really good example is the breaking of gender norms that really ruled fashion for the last 200 to 300 years. We just have to remember that there was a time in the not so distant past where a woman wearing pants caused just as much of an uproar as men or non-binary, more masculine presenting people have in very recent years. It really makes you think how likely it's going to be that we look back on this time in the very near future and think that it is insane that anyone was outraged that someone was wearing some cloth cut a certain way that someone deemed they shouldn't wear because they should wear cloth that's cut in a different way. It also really makes you wonder, what will stepping outside of the norm look like in, say, 30 years? Although the term youthquake was coined in the 1960s, youth culture in America truly began to emerge in the 20s. In America specifically, the 1920s was a very prosperous time. So many people began to move from more rural areas to more urban ones. This caused a major shift in values, and particularly when it came to the youth. Every time I say youth, I feel like a 90-year-old grandpa. Young people of the 20s had their own slang, had their own culture, had their own music, had their own fashion. And all of this was pretty contradictory to those of older generations. Many young people began to question or even reject the values of their parents, rebelling and experimenting with fashion and music and dancing. This led to more freedom and to the ability to chip away at barriers for those young people. The flappers of the 1920s were young women who were known for both their freedom of dress and lifestyle. My great aunt was actually a flapper. But flappers were largely considered to be the first generation of the independent American woman. They pushed barriers in politics and sex and the idea of how a woman should live her life. The 1920s was also a time of major innovations. New innovations like the automobile allowed young people to have more freedom than their parents ever did. They could travel around unsupervised, which led to a new culture of casual dating. Thanks, guys. Many kids and teens of the time no longer had to work, so they had the opportunity to spend more time in schools. And because they spent more time in school, they spent more time around other young people. So, of course, school became this breeding ground for new and fresh ideas. Fashion-wise, traditional corsetry and undergarments became optional for young women. Hemlines raised, although it was not yet above the knee like some movies or costumes show. And trendy dresses had a straighter, more boyish style. Shoes were made out of canvas at the time, making them lighter and easier to move and to dance in. And at the end of World War I, the economic boom and the jazz age ushered in this new culture of dancing and parties. So because of that, simplicity really became key when it came to fashion, because the silhouette had to be cute but easy to move in. This led to the removal of multiple layers in favor of lighter options. The popular look of the time was the La Garçon tubular style dress. Waistlines dropped until 1923, but then they started to rise again in 1928. Hemlines rose until about 1926, but then they began to drop again afterwards. Although hemlines were not yet raised above the knee, a little knee would flash here and there when someone was dancing. So, because of this little knee flash, a lot more rebellious girls of the time would rouge their knees or even paint their knees to make them more appealing when they were seen. Rolled stockings also became a fad at the time to show off a little knee when you were moving or dancing or sitting. The budding movie industry of the time also had a pretty big impact on young people and fashion. Bobbed hair and the use of cosmetics surged. Women experimented with makeup more than ever before in the modern West. They rouged their cheeks, plucked their eyebrows, and wore bolder lipsticks and eye makeup. While many Victorian and Edwardian women did use makeup, it was used discreetly to be socially appropriate. At the beginning of the 1920s, makeup was worn in a more subtle manner. But by the mid-20s, many women wore more makeup publicly and boldly. The post-war economic boom led to an increase in manufacturing and allowed more companies to establish themselves and to get their cosmetics out to the masses. Another interesting fact is that the discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922 majorly influenced fashion, makeup, architecture, decor. This can be seen throughout the 1920s and 30s and can even be attributed to the Art Deco style that we think of when we think of the 1930s. The Egyptian kohl-rimmed eyes inspired the use of eyeliner in 1920s makeup trends. The most popular 1920s look was a smooth, natural complexion, a rouged, rosy cheek, a dainty red lip shade, and thin eyebrows that were sometimes drawn beyond the natural brow line. At this time, fashion also kind of drifted away from clothing being the main accessory to the body being the main accessory. And don't get me wrong, body types have been on and off trend somehow for all of modern history. Unfortunately, people have decided to pick and choose what body types they like at different times and shame people who don't have those body types. But in the 1920s, this was a pretty big problem. The long and androgynous lines that were in favored bodies that were free of curves. So this led to a lot of really dangerous diets. Many flappers were said to have lived on just celery and tomatoes and lettuce. Also, many silent film stars would endure regular enemas. It was definitely a start, and a very dangerous one at that, to the modern diet culture that we see today. While being able to control their own diets may have seemed like a powerful move for many young women at the time, diet culture has led to oppression and unrealistic beauty standards that still affect us horribly today. So on the other hand, menswear, much like women's wear, valued simplicity too. Men moved away from the three-piece suits and the starched collars and started wearing a soft collar and two-piece suits. More comfortable wide-leg trousers also became a statement piece for men. While these changes in fashion may not seem like a huge deal to our 21st century brains, it actually was a major shift in culture and in values of the time. Women especially took to the clubs and took to the parties and took power away from older generations that would have deemed that behavior as unacceptable. As I mentioned earlier, the term youthquake was specifically coined for the 1960s and for the youth that were making major impacts and changes when it came to culture. But the impact that the youth had at this time expands beyond fashion. The youthquake was a movement that impacted and was impacted by other movements at the time. A lot of changes were happening as baby boomers came into adulthood. However, I will just be focusing on how the youthquake impacted fashion specifically. It really changed the landscape of the fashion industry as a whole. During World War II in the 1940s, many American women joined the workforce. Although films during this time showcased the glamour of Hollywood's golden age stars, for many people at home, fashion choices were more limited following the Great Depression. Due to the war, many materials were rationed, and many women began wearing pants and workwear as they took over laborious jobs at home. After the war, many Americans idealized femininity. The launch of Christian Dior's new look in 1947 spearheaded the newest ideal silhouette, a cinched waist and a full skirt. This style led to a decade-long trend in ultra-feminine long full skirts, long pencil skirts, cardigans, and conservative styles that idealized an hourglass shape. When the 1960s rolled around, many young people rejected the styles of their parents, much like the 1920s, and probably much like young people throughout history.
Are as concerned as their parents with the public's conception of today's youth. These students are portraying what we consider bad taste in school attire and behavior. This student is wearing an extremely tight skirt.
Women's economic, sexual, and social independence movements were seen as a catalyst for this change in fashion-related ideals. In England specifically, young people seemed bored with couture houses' designs that were geared towards older people. So, young people started looking to boutiques for inspiration. Youth subcultures like mods, hippies, and rockers challenged the dominance of Paris couture. Many of these subcultures challenged gender norms, embraced sexuality, and embraced boldness. British designer Mary Quant is often cited as the inventor of one of the 1960s most iconic statement pieces, the miniskirt. Although it seems to be unclear about who really deserves the credit for the invention of the style, if anyone at all does, because skirts were gradually getting shorter throughout the 20th century, what is clear was the impact that the miniskirt had on the masses. Much like young women of the 1920s, many girls and women of the 1960s used fashion as freedom. They broke away from traditional norms of their parents and expressed themselves through fashion. Everything from miniskirts to straight leg jeans to flare jeans to space-aged funky dresses that were inspired by the 1960s space race was on trend. Mass marketers quickly hopped on these trends to appease their young patrons. And while magazines had been targeting teenage girls since 1944 when 17 magazine first hit the shelves, more teen magazines really started seeing a gold mine when they realized the purchasing power of young people. All of these magazines helped to spread the trends among the youth of that time. It's interesting because in the 1960s, body ideals actually started to revert back to the ideals of the 1920s when the youth once again took charge. Long, slender, and boyish features were popularized by iconic figures like Twiggy. Since the early 2000s pretty much idealized a really similar body type to the body types that were popular in the 60s and the 20s, I really wonder if that has to do with youth domination at all. Maybe it's the connection that people make between young people and the lack of curves or a body that is still developing. I don't know, but it's interesting. So I wanted to bring up the early 2000s as kind of an honorable mention. It's not ever really brought up in this conversation, at least not from what I've seen. But I feel like it's a really, really pivotal point in youth domination. The rise of the teen pop star contributed heavily to this. This was a time in which the most popular movies, TV shows, and music were almost all geared towards an audience under 30. Fashion worn by young celebrities became more rebellious, with the use of crop tops and low-rise jeans, the thong look, and bolder colors. Some of the biggest stars and voices were literally as young as 13. The child star went from being mostly just a compliment to a family sitcom to being the star of their own. Even moving into the later part of the early 2000s, social media was really on the rise with sites like MySpace and Facebook, And these sites were mostly used by young people, an integral part of young people's lives. This created a culture in which teens, tweens, and young adults could communicate with other young people from the other side of the world and set their own trends and spread the word on their own. And this made it so that there was no longer the need for a middleman like magazine editors or TV and filmmakers. Obviously, magazines and TV and film still very much inspired fashion, but that fashion was also inspired by young people. Many young people of the early 2000s also had movements in which they were very passionate about. Many animal rights activists protested the use of animal furs in haute couture, leading to many fashion houses using alternatives. Also, the lack of diversity in Hollywood and in media became a hot button issue. While the masses may not have been as forward-thinking as many people are now, the need for Black and brown voices in media was definitely discussed. Black culture's influence on fashion also became more mainstream at this time, but credit was not always given where credit was due. And this is something that still needs to be worked on today. So are we experiencing another youthquake right now? I would say 1,000%. This generation is more involved and more educated than ever on social issues, and this stems from the amount of access that we have. We have access to all of the information in the world, both real and conspiracy, and we have access to practically all of the people in the world. So because of this, fashion and the idea of fashion and trends are more accessible to the masses than they have ever been. Now, this has led to fast fashion, which is very problematic in its own right and has definitely wreaked havoc on the environment and on human rights issues. But it is a very real aspect of our time, and it's a very nuanced issue. So it's not quite black and white. But because of this, trend cycles move faster than ever, with the youth being major contributors, but this has led to overconsumption being a major problem. As social media grows, the youth rules more and more and more. An outfit can be worn by a single influencer and be a major trend by the next day. We will talk about micro trends at a later time because that, again, is a very complicated issue. A cause or an issue that is impacting a certain group of people can be posted by someone who has 3 million followers or someone who has 1,000 followers and garner the same amount of attention. Although social media has caused a lot of issues for young people, which I can most definitely attest to, it has given us the opportunity to influence millions. Just your typical, normal, small town kid in their bedroom can reach millions of people.
Well, I'm 20 frunk years old and I'm a content creator.
That has never happened before. And this moment in history, I'm sure, will be monumental because of its young people and because of its influence. In conclusion, the Youthquake was really never just a one-time, one-place event. It is a low rumble that has gotten stronger and stronger every single year since the early 20th century. Each new generation has garnered more influence than the last. Has it improved the quality of each generation's lives? That is debatable. But what it has given us is influence, and we can respect that and use it wisely, or we could be reckless. So go out there and set your own trends and be an influence. Use your influence. Be your own influence. And just be a voice for your generation, because it really does matter. A positive one, please, because this is my generation too. Thank you so much for hanging out with me and for chatting with me today. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Leave a comment down below. Tell me what you want to talk about. What do you want to hear? Is there any moment in fashion history or in history in general? Anything about social issues? Let me know, and I will make a video about it.